The morning I handed my son a counteroffer on his own buyout proposal, he laughed. Not a mean laugh, just surprised. Like he couldn't believe the woman who used to pack his school lunches in a paper bag had read the fine print. He stopped laughing by afternoon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up 23 years, because that's where this story actually starts. Not in a conference room, not over a contract, but in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, with a broken dishwasher and a daughter-in-law I hadn't met yet, and a son who still called me every Sunday. I started my alteration shop the year my husband left. Not left as in died, left as in packed a bag on a Tuesday and was gone by Thursday. My son was 9. I had a sewing machine, a $600 security deposit on a storefront the size of a walk-in closet, and exactly the kind of stubbornness that people call resilience after the fact. The shop was called Mending Well. I know. It sounds like a greeting card, but I meant it both ways. The mending and the doing it well. And when people brought me their wedding dresses and their grandfather's military uniforms and their daughter's prom gowns, they weren't just bringing something me fabric. They were bringing me something that mattered. I treated it that way. Word spread the way it does in small cities. Slowly, then all at once. By the time my son was in high school, I had 3 employees. By the time he graduated college, I had a second location in Westerville. By the time he got his MBA and came back to Columbus with his fiancée and a handshake full of ideas, I had 4 shops, a corporate alterations contract with 2 hotel chains, and a reputation that had taken me the better part of 2 decades to build. He walked into my back office one October afternoon and said, "Mom, I want to talk to you about the business." I set down my seam ripper and looked at him. He was 31 years old. He looked exactly like his father around the eyes, which I had stopped mentioning because it wasn't his fault. He sat down across from me and put a folder on the cutting table, and I thought, for one moment, that he was going to ask me for a job. He didn't ask for a job. He asked for the company. Not in those words. The words he used were partnership structure and equity stake and scaling potential. He'd brought charts, color-coded ones, which I respected even as my stomach dropped. He'd been thinking about this for a while. He and his wife, they'd gotten married the previous spring, small ceremony. Lovely. I sat in the front row and cried the appropriate amount. Had apparently spent the better part of 6 months building out what he called a growth roadmap for Mending Well. "You've built something incredible," he said, and he meant it. I could tell he meant it. "But Mom, you're 63. You're not slowing down, but you could. You should be able to, and I can take this to the next level." I asked him what next level meant. He said, "Franchise model, national rollout, 15 locations in 3 years, pull in private equity, standardize the brand, move away from the high-touch custom work and toward volume." I picked up my seam ripper again. Not to use it, just to have something in my hand. I told him I'd think about it. I did think about it. For about 2 weeks, I thought about almost nothing else. I'd lie awake at 3 in the morning running numbers in my head, not because I was afraid of growth. I wasn't. But because something about the plan felt like it was describing a different business than the one I'd built. Volume over craft, scale over relationship. I'd spent 23 years making sure that when a woman brought me her mother's wedding gown to be restored, she left crying the good kind of tears. I wasn't sure that survived a franchise model, but I was also 63, and he was my son. And I had worked very hard, and I was tired in the specific way that people get tired when they've been doing something alone for a very long time. So I told him yes, with conditions. The conditions were reasonable. I retained creative oversight on stand. Any decision to discontinue the custom restoration work required my approval. My name stayed on the business. Not as a figurehead, but as a co-owner with real authority. We'd split equity 60-40, with my 60 decreasing to 50 over 5 years if targets were met. He shook my hand. His wife, she was there too, which I noted but didn't comment on, smiled and said, "This is going to be so great, Renata." She always called me by my first name. I had made my peace with it. We signed the paperwork in January. By March, I could feel something shifting. It was small things at first. He'd schedule vendor meetings and forget to copy me. I'd find out about decisions, a new booking software, a change to the intake form after they'd already been implemented. When I raised it, he'd apologize. Genuinely, I think. He's not a cruel person, my son. He just had a way of moving fast and assuming I'd be fine with wherever he landed. His wife started coming to the shops more, which was fine. She had a good eye for marketing, and I said so. But she started making suggestions to my staff, not to me, directly to my staff, about how things should be done. Workflow changes, customer communication scripts. Little things that added up. In April, she redesigned the logo without telling me. It wasn't a bad logo. That's the part that made it harder. It was clean, modern, professionally done, but it wasn't mine. And when I found out, not from my son, not from his wife, but from my shop manager in Westerville who texted me a picture of the new sign going up, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while before I went inside. I called my son. He said, "Oh, I meant to tell you. Kristen had this great connection at a branding firm, and it just kind of happened fast. You like it, right? It's sharp." I said I would have liked to have been part of that conversation. He said, "Mom, this is exactly the kind of thing I meant when I said I wanted to take it to the next level. You can't approve every little decision." The logo was not a little decision, but I let it go because he was my son, because I wanted this to work, because I had spent 23 years making things work by being the person who bent when she had to. The summer was a lesson in watching something you built get slowly rearranged around you. The intake process changed. The custom restoration work got temporarily deprioritized in favor of the hotel contract volume, which was fine in theory and quietly devastating in practice. 3 of my long-term seamstresses gave notice. 2 of them had been with me for over a decade, because the pace had changed and the work wasn't what they'd signed on for. My son called it natural attrition. I called it losing people who were irreplaceable. We disagreed on that point, politely, and nothing changed. In August, he called me into a meeting. Not at the shop. At the offices he'd leased downtown. New overhead, one of the many expenditures that had not exactly been in the original plan. He and his wife were both there. There was water on the table and a folder in front of him, and I had a feeling I recognized from 23 years of running a business, which is the feeling of knowing what someone is about to say before they say it. He said they'd been reviewing the equity structure. He said the growth had been faster than expected, and the original terms didn't reflect the current value of the contributions being made, meaning his contributions, meaning his wife's contributions, and that they felt it was time to revisit. The new proposal was on paper in front of me. He wanted to buy out my remaining shares, not immediately, over 2 years, at a valuation that his firm had done, not an independent one. He'd keep the name. He'd keep the brand. He'd keep everything I'd built. And I would walk away with a check and what he called an advisory role, which everyone in every business negotiation in the history of the world knows means nothing. I read the document carefully. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I asked him if he remembered why I named the business Mending Well. He said he remembered. I said, "Then you understand that I'm going to need a few days." He said, of course. He was very reasonable about it, very calm. He'd clearly been expecting me to cry, or to argue, or to immediately say yes because that's what I'd always done. Bent when it mattered most. I drove home. I called my attorney, a woman named Helen, who had helped me structure the original partnership, and who had the particular quality I valued most in a lawyer, which is that she got angry on my behalf so I didn't have to. Helen read the buyout proposal and called me back in 40 minutes. "Renata," she said, "do you remember the clause we put in about creative oversight?" I said I did. She said, "And do you remember what we tied it to?" I did remember. Because I had insisted on it back in January, when my son kept talking about scaling, and I kept thinking about my seamstresses and my restoration clients, and the weight of a thing made carefully. We had tied the creative oversight clause to a specific protection. Any buyout of my shares, voluntary or otherwise, required a 60-day notice period and an independent valuation. Not his firm's valuation, an independent one. And there was one more thing. There was a clause, small, quiet, the kind of thing that gets buried in the middle of page 6, that said if the business made any significant operational or branding change without documented co-owner approval during the first 3 years of the partnership, it triggered a penalty that restructured the equity in my favor. The logo, the intake process, the deprioritization of restoration services, the staffing changes, none of them had my documented approval. Helen told me what that meant in numbers. I made a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at when my son was 9 years old, doing homework while I sewed alterations by lamplight, and I thought about what I wanted. Not what I was owed, not what I could get. What I wanted. I wanted the business I'd built to survive. I wanted the work, the real work, the careful work, to matter to someone. I wanted my son, if I'm being honest, to understand what he'd been slowly dismantling without quite realizing it. I thought about my seamstresses who'd left. I thought about the woman who'd brought me her mother's beaded gown 6 months ago, so fragile it had to be handled with cotton gloves. I'd worked on it for 2 weeks. It had taken me an hour to find the right thread. She'd sent me a photograph of herself wearing it at her own daughter's wedding, and I'd put it on the refrigerator. That photograph was still on my refrigerator. I called Helen back. I told her what I wanted her to do. She drafted a counteroffer. Not a lawsuit, not a cease and desist. A counteroffer that laid out, clearly and without drama, exactly what those undocumented changes had triggered under our existing agreement. The numbers, the equity restructuring, what it meant for the buyout he'd proposed. I also wrote a letter, by hand, because some things need to be done that way, not long. 1 page. I told my son that I understood he was ambitious and that I had always loved that about him. I told him that the business had not always been easy and that there were years when I was not sure it would survive, and that those years had shaped me in ways that couldn't be replicated in a spreadsheet. I told him that I wasn't angry, and I told him that I hoped, when this was over, we could have dinner and talk. Not about business, but about other things. About the things that had been harder to talk about since his father left. And since the company got bigger, and since there was always another meeting to get to. Helen had the documents on his desk by Thursday morning. He called me that afternoon. He didn't laugh this time. He was quiet for a while on the phone. I let him be quiet. I'd earned the silence. He said, "I didn't read it that carefully." I said, "I know." He said, "She's upset. She thinks this is an attack." I said, "It isn't an attack. It's a contract. We both signed it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Mom, the logo. I should have asked you." I said, "Yes." He said, "It was faster not to. We were moving fast, and I thought you'd be okay with it." I said, "I know you thought that." And then I said the thing I'd been turning over for weeks, the thing that felt most true. "You've spent 30 years watching me be okay with things. That was my mistake more than yours." We talked for a long time that evening. Not about equity or valuations or franchises. About when he was small and used to sit on the floor of the shop and sort buttons into jars while I worked. About his father. About how proud I was, genuinely, of the man he'd become, not the businessman, the man. About how those two things had gotten confused somewhere along the way for both of us. By the end of October, we had a new agreement. Independent valuation. My number was higher than his firm's, which surprised him and didn't surprise me. Restoration services reinstated as a protected line, a formal approval process for brand and operational changes. His equity stake adjusted per the clause, which cost him, and which he accepted without argument. He kept the downtown office. I kept my back office at the original shop on 5th Avenue, the one with the bulletin board covered in photographs, and thank you notes, and one fabric swatch I'd saved from the very first wedding gown I ever restored, back when I didn't know what I was doing, and did it carefully anyway. His wife still calls me Renata. I've stopped making peace with it and started not minding it. There's a difference. Last month, my son stopped by the shop on a Saturday. Not for a meeting, just to stop by. He stood in the doorway watching one of my new seamstresses work. A young woman named Petra, 24 years old, faster than anyone I'd hired in years, and he said, "She's good." I said, "She's very good." He said, "How'd you find her?" I said, "Same way I've always found good people. I paid attention." He nodded. He looked around the shop, The cutting tables, the dress forms, the light coming through the front windows, the way it always has. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I forgot what it looked like in here." I said, "You've been busy." He said, "Yeah." And then, quieter, "I'm glad you didn't just sign it." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. I handed him a cup of coffee and went back to the hem I was working on, and he sat on the stool by the pressing table, the way he used to sit on the floor with the button jars. And for a little while, the shop was quiet, in the way it is when the right people are in it. I have worked for 30 years with a needle and thread. I have learned that the strongest seam is not the one you can see. It's the one that holds when everything else is pulling. Some things are worth mending carefully. Even when it takes a while, even when you have to unpick it first and start again. That's always been the work.